New business or we do that? Yeah, bring new business. I hereby call this meeting in Norwood City Council order. Please rise for prayer and pledge of allegiance. Our Father, who art in heaven, as a body we congregate in this council chambers. We pray for thy divine guidance, that we may do all things well, according to thy holy will. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mrs. Williams, will you call the roll?
Mr. Bunzel.
Here.
Mr. Gabbard.
Here.
Mr. Geraci.
Here.
Mr. Kelch.
Here.
Mr. DiNardo.
Here.
Mr. Thompson.
Here.
Mr. Braden.
Here.
All members present. Moving on to amendment of agenda. This evening, we are removing item L5 from the agenda. And we are adding this attachment that you received to L3. And that is all the changes to the agenda that I had this evening.
Who requested L5 to be removed?
Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. President. I received an email from Patrick, bond counsel, saying that they're going to have to redo the funding structure, the financing structure for that, and that they will bring back a new version for the Linden Point TIF refinancing ordinance. We'll bring that back to us later this year.
Mr. Thompson.
Move that we amend the agenda as you have stated.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to amend the agenda. Mr. Braden? Second. Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Moving on to item F, minutes of previous meeting, March 23rd, 2021. Mr. DiNardo.
I move that we accept the minutes.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to accept the minutes. May I have a second? Mr. Kelch.
Second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, motion passes. Moving on to item H. We have a request to address council. Chief William Kramer presents Robert Town with a life-saving award. Chief Kramer.
Good evening. Thanks for allowing me to come up and have a few minutes of your time tonight. I am here to present Robert Town with a life-saving award. You might recall, I don't know, maybe January, sometime just a little bit ago, I was here presenting Robert with a life-saving award. And I don't think even Robert knows this, but he's actually getting two tonight. So I'll go over each one of them. He's taken my last two, so we're done saving lives until I can order more medals because Robert's taken them all. So anyway, the first one, on January 13th, Robert responded to a 911 call where the caller stated that she wanted to commit suicide and was going to jump off the Montgomery Road overpass to State Route 562. Robert was the first one on the scene and found the female pushing herself up on the ledge. He approached, made contact with her, and when she turned her attention to the lights and sirens of an approaching police vehicle, he ran up, pulled her away, and back to the sidewalk to safety. His quick thinking and actions stopped this distraught person from harming herself, possibly killing herself. Robert just does an amazing job. He's committed to this department, to the city, dedicated. He takes pride in everything he does. And again, if it wasn't for his quick actions, we don't know what might have happened that night. So that is the first one that he is getting one for. I'll go over both of them, and then Robert can come up. And then just recently here on March 6th, there was a house fire, a really bad house fire on Sherman Avenue. And before Robert got there, a neighbor was there trying to get the door open but was unable to. Upon Robert's arrival, he could hear people yelling behind the door, or he could hear someone yelling for help. He reacted quickly, kicking the door 3 times before he was finally able to open it. Once the door opened, a lot of smoke that came out, and he directed a young kid out of the building to safety. The young kid's father was still in the house. Unfortunately, the father did not make it. Robert checked the house as best he could with the flashlight, but was unable to see anything more than a foot into the residence. Sergeant Thomas directed him that it was too dangerous to enter. Again, absent Robert's quick actions, it's very likely that the young kid would have been killed too. So for this, Robert is receiving his 3rd Norwood Life Saving Award. And I will say, to the best of my knowledge, at least since I've been chief, nobody has received more than one. So I'm very proud of Robert, and he should be proud of himself. So Robert, if you want to come on up and get these. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Kramer.
He's going to look like Prince Philip when this is all done.
So next request to address council, Pastor Sonny James.
Pastor Sonny James, 1830 Hopkins Avenue, Norwood, Ohio. First, as they're leaving, I want to just congratulate the young children that have come to council to participate, and that's always awesome to see our youth. I also want to first pay respect to the families, not just locally, but across the country, that are still struggling with the pandemic. And my heart certainly goes out to them. And then I just want to make sure that we continue to recognize that even in the climate that we're facing as a nation, black people are still, people of color are still finding themselves facing racial disparities from those in power. And we just pray that we continue to press toward a more positive way of life. I'm actually proud of each of you tonight to see that you all stood to acknowledge one of our police officers, and we certainly respect Robert and the wonderful work that he's providing to our residents. I'd also like to urge the chief, it's nice when we celebrate people that have a recognized title, but if you all recall, not too long ago, each and every one of you received a letter where 2 residents had been approached by a gentleman with a firearm, and of course yours truly intervened, and that resident would tell you they felt that their life was saved that day. And I didn't get any comment from anybody, and when I talked to our chief, he said, well, Pastor, what did you expect us to say? Well, I get it, guys. I know that we still have a long way to go, but I'm telling you, I applaud that this community is coming a long way. And I know it's not easy. I don't always have to be involved. I just like to see that we're getting more people of color involved, because then it's a victory for our community. But I would want to encourage you all that when you find that things are being done, you know, you have a responsibility to the community and to the residents to recognize and acknowledge the things that you're notified about. And when it doesn't happen, it really makes it difficult for us to believe that we're really together or that we have a desire to be together, because when not one person acknowledges and says, oh wow, I'm glad that a resident is still alive, because of that. Can you imagine how that would make others feel when they stand in a room applauding with the rest of you? So it's proven that you guys do recognize good work. But to me, sometimes it still looks like you want to recognize good work from people that are part of your status quo. I just want us to say, hey, every third grader in our community should have an opportunity to pursue life, as the Bible says that we should have life and that life more abundantly. But when we have an administration that does not honor that, or if we have events in the park and we stand before people and say, I personally don't think people should be out there, and then literally weeks later you go out there yourself, those things just don't look right. And I know I probably stand before you all the time and you say, here we go again. But here's my challenge. Why don't some of you look in the mirror and say, you know what? Pastor James is right. Here we go again. And so I just want to tell you that I love what's happening in Norwood. We're moving closer to becoming that suburb that many of us only dream about, and that I personally can't wait to become more and more and more a part of that dream as well. But I do want to just encourage us just to remember the little guy, and everybody has equal right to be acknowledged, to be recognized, and to be celebrated. And when you don't do that, you've got to ask yourself honestly, why not? Why don't we do that? What would it hurt? God bless you guys. Let's continue to pray for our families that are struggling out there. I was so pleased that our president of council handed me a piece of paper. I'm sure he's going to mention it later. I did speak with Hamilton County Commissioner Alicia Reese about it weeks ago, and it's doing great work helping people that are in financial need. So God bless you all. Let's keep pressing toward that mark. Have a blessed evening.
Thank you, Pastor James. Our next request to address council is Mr. Greg Wiles.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Greg Wiles. I live at 3920 Lindley Avenue, and I'm here to talk about the home next door to me, which is 3924 Lindley Avenue. First of all, lived in Norwood pretty much all my life. Lived on Lindley, my childhood home. I purchased it back in 2001, and it's a fairly high-density student housing area, but I'm not here to talk about that tonight. Norwood Police have done a very good job keeping the noise down and stuff, and we've been able to live there. Not too much trouble, actually. The house next door to me at 3924 was a student housing house for probably the last, I'd say, 12 years. And the previous landlord was a very responsible landlord for student housing, and he kept the students in line pretty well, and he would communicate with me quite often. But recently, this house, he sold it about a year ago, and over the last 3 to 4 weeks, this house has turned into a sober house or a drug recovery home. And there's men staying there that are probably from the age of 25 to mid-70s. There's a constant rotation of residents in this house. They're pretty loud at times. They like to go outside and smoke a lot, I guess because they're recovering, and they're kind of loud and obnoxious. And there's probably been at least 30 different men there over this last 3 weeks. There's always at least 8 to 10 in the house. One of the residents told me that they have room in there for 14 men to be in there. So I know it's a 7-bedroom house. So There's 2 on the 3rd floor, 4 on the 2nd floor, and 1 bedroom they turned into a bedroom on the 1st floor. So I'm figuring they put in 2 beds per bedroom. So it's a safety concern for my wife and I and for some of my neighbors. Last Thursday night, there was a lot of ruckus going on next door, and I thought there was going to be a big fight. They were arguing very loudly. I didn't call the police. And after about a half hour or so, it kind of calmed down a little bit. Saturday, so we were doing work in the backyard, and my wife and I, and one of the young men was having a psychotic episode in the backyard. He started just going berserk for like 40 minutes, and finally, I decided that I should call the police. Called the police. Police came, and there was no supervision there. Usually there's somebody supervising these guys, or sometimes there's somebody supervising these guys. And but there was nobody there at that time. And the guy ran through the neighborhood before the policeman could get there. And when the policeman did get there, one of them left to look for him, and the other one was taking a report from the administrator who showed up about the same time the police got there. So, like I said, this is a real safety concern, and I just want to make it clear that I have notified the building department, and they are working on this. So I'm not here to say that anybody in Norwood's not doing their job here. Mark Reeves is definitely looking into it, and I appreciate it. But I thought it would be beneficial to address you all in person, just so you can know what's going on. And we're very concerned about this. Neighbors are very concerned, and I don't really know what else to say other than I would appreciate all your efforts. One other thing, these men come in vans or pickup trucks just with duffel bags. They do not drive. They do not, walk there. They're brought there, and then they're taken away. People come bring food to them, and then they leave. So they're largely unsupervised, but not completely. But sometimes they are completely unsupervised.
Thank you, Mr. Wiles.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Moving forward to item I, reports of standing committees of council, housing, health, and public safety, April 6, 2021. Mr. Tracy.
Committee report, Housing, Health, and Public Safety, date 4/6/2021, to the Honorable Council of the City of Norwood. We are Committee of Housing, Health, and Public Safety, to whom it was referred a discussion on the Chronic Nuisance Task Force. We did not have anything to discuss, as the people that we had invited to the meeting did not show up. Respectfully submitted, Mr. Matthew Geraci, Chairperson, Mr. Michael Gabbard, Mr. James Bonzel, Mr. Chris Kelch.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Mr. Kelch.
We receive and file a letter.
Motion by Mr. Kelch to receive and file a report. Mr. Tracy.
Second.
Second by Mr. Tracy. Any discussion?
Yeah, who was supposed to show up?
We had invited the members of the task force, whom we didn't know at the time who it was supposed to be until that night. We didn't know who was going to be on that task force. The safety service director was supposed to set that up. It wasn't set up, so safety service director, and the 4 members didn't show up, so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Leonardo. Anyone else? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting aye. Motion passes. Moving on to item J, third reading of ordinances and resolutions. Item J1, ordinance reauthorizing the mayor and/or safety service director to enter into an amended easement agreement with Regent Realty LLC for Schoolhouse Outfitters LLC as originally authorized in ordinance number 35-2014 and declaring an emergency. Mr. DiNardo.
Can I have the third reading, please?
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to have the third read. Mr. Kelch?
Second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have the third reading?
Ordinance reauthorizing the mayor and/or safety service director to enter into an amended easement agreement with Regent Realty LLC for Schoolhouse Outfitters LLC as originally authorized in ordinance 35-2014 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Braden.
A motion that the ordinance be passed?
Motion by Mr. Braden that the ordinance be passed. May I have a second? Mr. Thompson.
Second that?
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes,
All
ma'am.
members present voting aye. The ordinance passes. Moving on to item K, second reading of ordinances and resolutions. Resolution declaring it necessary to levy a tax in excess of the 10 mil limitation and to notify the Board of Elections of Hamilton County to cause the notice of election to be given as required by law on the question of levying an 8 mil renewal property tax for the current operating expenses of the city of Norwood and declaring an emergency. Mr. DiNardo.
Motion we have the second reading of this?
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to have the second reading. May I have a second? Mr. Thompson.
Second.
Any discussion?
Sure.
Mr.
The
DiNardo.
reason for my motion was because it's no longer needed by May, so we have time. We can follow the normal process.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Anyone else? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. Motion passes. May we have the second reading, Mrs. Williams?
Resolution declaring it necessary to levy a tax in excess of the 10 mil limitation and to notify the Board of Elections of Hamilton County to cause the notice of election to be given as required by law on the question of levying an 8 mil renewal property tax for the current operating expenses of the city of Norwood and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Moving on to item L, introductory reading of ordinances and resolutions. L1, ordinance adjusting certain salary ranges and amending ordinance number 24-2020 and declaring an emergency. Mr. Thompson.
Motion we have the first reading of the ordinance?
Motion by Mr. Thompson to have the first reading. May I have a second? Mr. Braden.
Second.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Mr. Thompson.
Just like to ask what certain salary ranges have been adjusted on this ordinance as compared to our previous ordinance?
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mayor Schneider.
The three, or basically the five that you see at the top, and this is one of the reasons why I say I'd rather you have all three readings and pass this. Two of those are the Recreation Office Manager and the Recreation Program Director. So if we're going to wait, and it's going to take 6 weeks to do this, we're getting to a point where we can't hire people, and we can't get the Recreation Office opened, we can't do much. It already takes a while to get a person onboarded. If we're going to wait 6 weeks before we can even do that, that's going to be a challenge. The Budget Director, Human Resource Manager, and Project Manager, the only one out of those three, or the Project Manager, is funded. So those are positions that we'd like to have in place. We found rather quickly that the Safety Service Director cannot work as the Safety Service Director as well as Project Manager. So with the funding that's in place, and this is something that I don't think the fire chief's not back there, but one of the things that we had a discussion about is, it is April. We're already past the first quarter of the year. We are, now that we've got the budget in place, and hopefully we're going to pass appropriations, we've got actually money that we can commit to spending to get projects done, which means we start contacting our contractors now and saying, hey, we can sign the contract now. And they tell us, okay, we'll get around to that in maybe November or December, or we won't get to it this year because we're already booked up because we're so far, they're already booking things up. Other communities pass their budget in January, and by February and March, they've already signed contracts and they've got stuff working. So that's a concern with the staffing part of it. I don't think there are really changes to the numbers on the lower level positions, and Keith, if you could correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there were any changes made to those ranges. But then Section 4 was changed, which goes from a 5% discretion to, it gives the hiring authority a 10% discretion. So if a person's going to come in at, $60,000, we can negotiate with them and potentially get them in, above the base to $63,000. Other than that, we still have to come to council. But, I do feel like the administration is behind the 8 ball to get things done, and if we do this in 3 readings, we're going to be even further behind it. If we go above this, we've got to come back to you, and much like I did with the recreation director, I'll come to you with the qualifications and reason why. But, our goal as the recreation office manager and the recreation program director, we hope to close on the building this week. And we'd hope to close on the building the first of the month. It's going to be, another few days before we close on it. And then we've got to get staff in place. We've got to get recreation department staff in place to really get moving. So.
Thank you, Mayor Schneider.
Long-winded, I'm sorry.
Mr. Thompson.
Right. So just to clarify, it's the changes are the 10% above the lowest in range when negotiating, and we're adding those 5 positions at the top. Those weren't there beforehand?
That's correct. And
Okay.
two of those positions, the budget director and human resource manager positions, are not actually funded in the budget.
Okay.
The only way I could get that one of those filled is if I didn't use, say, right now I don't have an administrative assistant to the mayor. I could potentially say, okay, instead of doing that guy, we could do the human resources manager, but I got to look at how that all
Right.
works.
This just establishes those ranges, though, so you
Correct.
have the opportunity.
Yes.
Thank you, Mayor Schneider. Anyone else? Mr. Bonzo.
I was just curious, the Section 4, and maybe this could be to the law director, so 2 questions. One, that 10%, that where the hiring manager can give some leeway or some leverage, that was there in the original ordinance, right, that we passed in 2020?
I'm going to have to defer to the mayor. I don't remember, but if he says that we're raising the 5 to 10, then that's,
Oh, okay.
I guess what it is.
been.
I didn't actually type this up, so that detail is not, I don't really know.
I think the original was 5%.
Was it 5%? Okay.
Yeah.
The other part of this, so it says, from this day forward, the ranges specified in this ordinance shall be adjusted as council determines and specifies in future ordinances for that purpose. How does that differ from what, I guess I'm just curious why that line is in there.
That's the same as, that italicized line is the same.
Exact same. That was, okay,
Yeah.
just checking. Perfect, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Mr. Nardo?
Does that change anything for you?
Mr. Thompson?
Yeah, I'll revise my motion to have all 3 readings.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to suspend the rules and have all 3 readings. Mr. Braden?
I will revise, yes, I'll second that. And revise my, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Second by Mr. Braden to suspend the rules and have all 3 readings. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all 3 readings?
Ordinance adjusting certain salary ranges and amending ordinance number 24-2020 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance adjusting certain salary ranges and amending ordinance number 24-2020 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance adjusting certain salary ranges and amending ordinance number 24-2020 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Gentlemen? Mr. Thompson?
I will move that we pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to pass the ordinance. Mr. DiNardo?
Second, please.
Second by Mr. DiNardo. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, the ordinance passes. Moving on to item L2, ordinance promoting the citywide street sale, May 14th and 15th, 2021, and abating all permit fees associated with the sale and declaring an emergency. Mr. Bonzo.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would move that we have all 3 readings of the ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Bonzo to have all 3 readings. May I have a second? Mr. Kelch?
Second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Mr. Bonzo?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. So, every year we do the citywide street sale. We usually actually do it twice a year. And essentially, the city has a yard sale ordinance and essentially abates the fees for the yard sale ordinance and allows, and then we also do a registry, basically, of all the locations in the city that have registered, so people can know where to go. So essentially, this year we've got it set for May 14th and 15th, or at least for the spring. We may do one again in the fall. And then I think it's the auditor's office, is that correct? Or is it the treasurer's office? The auditor, yeah. So essentially, anybody that wants to, starting, if we pass this today and the mayor signs it and everything today, essentially starting tomorrow or Thursday, they can go and register that they're going to have a street sale that day. So anyways, very much encourage people to do that if they want. We didn't have one last year, so hopefully there's quite a few of them this year. It's usually a lot of fun, so yeah, I hope we can get this passed today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Anyone else? Mr. Gabbard?
Just to clarify, I believe you do still have to have a permit. It's just that the fee is waived. And then I think they wanted us, Deb Simpson sent me a message that September 10th and 11th, just so people can have that on the radar for the fall one, which is the weekend after Labor Day, would be our fall dates. And then, so this is a great time for our citizens to have a yard sale, team up with your neighbors, have a street sale, and just get out there and have a little bit of fun with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gabbard. Anyone else? Mr. Bonzo?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, and I think Mr. Gabbard kind of touched on this, but Deb Simpson, she made sure the ball didn't get dropped on this one, so appreciate her reaching out to multiple people on that. I'd also like to ask the city administration, once we do get this passed, to send out a press release and a Facebook notification. It'd be great if the media knows about it, just so that they can let people know to be on the lookout for it whenever we get to the actual sale date, so we can get more traffic in and allow people to get rid of more of their junk. Or whatever you want to, unwanted goods, we'll say.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Anyone else? Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all 3 readings?
Ordinance promoting the citywide street sale, May 14th and 15th, 2021, and abating all permit fees associated with the sale and declaring an emergency. Ordinance promoting the citywide street sale, May 14th and 15th, 2021, and abating all permit fees associated with the sale and declaring an emergency. Ordinance promoting the citywide street sale, May 14th and 15th, 2021, and abating all permit fees associated with the sale and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Bonzo?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that we pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Bonzo to pass the ordinance. May I have a second? Mr. Braden?
I'll second that.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The ordinance passes. Moving on to item L3, ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Mr. DiNardo.
I would like to make a motion to have all 3 readings.
Motion by
Reflect the
Mr.
plan of the
DiNardo
past
to have all 3 readings. May I have a second? Mr. Bonzel.
Second, please.
Second by Mr. Bonzel. Any discussion?
I mean, just to mirror the plan, so we just like we did last year.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. May we have all 3 readings, Mrs. Williams?
Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. DiNardo.
I'd like to make a motion to pass the ordinance.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Motion to pass the ordinance. May I have a second? Mr. Thompson.
Second.
Thank you.
Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The ordinance passes. Moving on to item L4, an ordinance authorizing cooperation with the Port of Greater Cincinnati Development Authority to facilitate the issuance of Port Authority Development renewal bonds for the purpose of refunding of the city's outstanding tax increment financing revenue bonds, Series 600, Cornerstone at Norwood project, authorizing the execution and delivery of a tax increment financing and cooperative agreement, a second amended and restated service agreement, and all other documents and instruments necessary to effect such refunding, authorizing and approving related matters, and declaring an emergency. Mr. DiNardo.
I'd like to have the first reading of this, please.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to have the first reading. May I have a second?
Second, please.
Second by Mr. Bonzel. Any discussion? Mr. Bonzel?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I know that we have Pat Woodside and then Andy, is it Broussard, that's here. So if anybody, Pat Woodside thinks our legal counsel, I think Andy's the finance guy. But if there's any questions, or, I mean, Pat, do you want to say something about this, or just give a quick overview?
Yeah, I know that we've discussed this, I believe, a few times amongst the council and the committee and given some background, but basically what we're doing is there are existing bonds that are outstanding that were issued to finance the garage at Cornerstone. And the current interest rate environment would make it beneficial or financially advantageous to refund those bonds with new debt. We are going to have that new debt issued through the Cincinnati Port Authority's bond fund. And that bond fund is essentially a pool of money and other bond issuances that allow the new debt to be issued at a lower rate due to the additional security that's provided by that bond fund. So long story short, the goal here is to reduce the interest that is payable from TIF revenue that's generated by the private improvements and make the sort of the financial situation out there a little more viable in the long term. So if you have questions for me about the legal aspects of it, happy to answer it. And Andy Brookshart's here as well if you wanted to talk about the numbers. But like I said, I think we've discussed this before, but obviously happy to do so today.
Mr. Braden.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. So the motion on the floor is to have the first reading. Is there a time sensitive here? Would you like, I mean...
There is not. Our plan for this was to have first reading today and then come back on the 27th and have the second, third readings and consider it for passage.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Anyone else? Any further questions?
Is there, did you want to say anything? Okay.
You came all this way, why not?
You guys have heard from me enough. Yeah, so this was one of the two deals that we talked about, I think, a couple weeks ago in terms of refinancing. The other one that we discussed was Linden Point, and just to point that out, that was pulled off the agenda tonight. as we're still looking at certain options related to that, either through the city or through the bond fund, and we didn't feel it was appropriate to have a first reading when we are not certain where that's going yet. So to your point, though, we may be back at the next meeting with legislation for Linden Point, making a decision at that point in time, either the city or the bond fund for that portion.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Any further discussion? The motion on the floor is by Mr. DiNardo to have the first reading, second by Mr. Bonsall.
Yes, please.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. May we have the first reading?
All right, this is a long one, guys. An ordinance authorizing cooperation with the Port of Greater Cincinnati Development Authority to facilitate the issuance of Port Authority Development Revenue Bonds for the purpose of refunding of the city's outstanding tax increment financing revenue bonds, Series 2006, Cornerstone at Norwood Project, authorizing the execution and delivery of a tax increment financing and cooperative agreement, a second amended and restated service agreement, and all other documents and instruments necessary to effect such refunding, authorizing and approving related matters, and declaring an emergency. An ordinance authorizing cooperation. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're not.
I was all revved up to do three.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Moving on to item L6, an ordinance authorizing the City of Norwood to enter into community reinvestment area agreements with Playing Card Partners, LLC, authorizing the city to enter into a related school compensation with the Norwood City School District and declaring an emergency. May I have a motion? Mr. Thompson.
Move we would have all three readings of this ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to have all three readings. May I have a second? Mr. Gabbard?
We only need one today.
Oh, okay. I will resend.
Actually, we can't actually, I'll go through this, but we can't actually pass it today. But I'll go ahead and I'll.
Thank you.
Would you like to amend your
One it
motion?
is.
So what, I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, one reading?
Yes.
Motion by Mr. Thompson, have the first reading. Mr. Gabbard? Mr. Gabbard changed his motion, have one reading as well. Any discussion?
Yeah, I can get some background on this. This as well, I'm sure you're mostly all familiar with the PLK project. This particular legislation is with respect to the CRA exemption. That's a 15-year exemption that would apply to each of, I'm sure you all got some of these materials, not sure if you looked at them, but basically we have it split up into 5 different components. The reason for that is that they are different and they'll be on different timelines here. Where we are in this process, for those of you that aren't aware, the CRA process involves various steps in the procedure. We have provided notice to the school district of our proposed CRA agreements with the developer. And what those agreements, so let me back up one step. The developer submitted an application for each of the 5 elements of the project. That application is then incorporated as an exhibit to this agreement. That agreement is, assuming it is approved, that will be entered into between the city and the developer, and it will obligate them to construct the various elements of the project as described in the application. After the project is completed, there will be a determination, hopefully the project has been done in accordance with what's described in their application. Then at that point, there will be implemented the tax exemption for 15 years for each of those various elements of the project, assuming that it's done correctly. And so to the point of why we can't do this all today is that the school district is looking at this. We are working on a school compensation agreement. The school district currently has agreed, well, I would say that the board is not yet, but we're anticipating that on their, already April, at their May 11th meeting, they will approve the forms of these agreements, At that point, this council can approve them, and then we can enter into those agreements with the developer. So that's kind of where we are in the process. Let me know if you have questions about the process or these agreements or the legislation, and hopefully I will have the answers that you're looking for.
Anyone have any questions? Mr. Bonzel?
Yeah, thank you so much. The question I have is about around the, okay, so the financing, you said there was the school compensation agreement?
Yes.
Can you provide details, kind of like what goes into, is that just like the percentage of tax revenue that gets split, or like what is that?
Andy can give you the model, but yes, the agreement will basically, exactly, it will determine the amount of compensation that will go to the school district during the term of the various CRA taxes.
Yeah, so this gets a bit complicated. I think at our finance committee, we went through a lot of these details, but there's different levels of participation on the different assets that are going in. So for example, on the multifamily, the first phase one multifamily, the school districts are being comped for the first 15 years during the CRA period, around $75,000. That goes $75,000 split between Norwood schools and the JVS. After that 15-year period is up, the compensation goes to 65% for years 16 to 30 on the multifamily. So on the commercial, if you may stop there, you want any questions?
No, you're fine, you're fine.
Also, just so you know, we're going to be back too for the TIF, and the TIF will be a 30-year period. So the CRA exemption will be for the first 15 years, then the TIF will be the 15 through 16. So that's why, even though today we're doing the first reading of just the CRA, overall we'll have a TIF in place that will be implemented. That's the reason why the school compensation has to cover both and be for the full 30-year period.
The commercial is a little more straightforward. There's just a flat, about $55,000 a year compensation, again, split between the school district and the JVS for the full 30 years. And that's on the first phase of the commercial. The second phase of the multifamily, the compensation on that during the CRA period is 35%. And then years from 16 to 30, it goes to 100% of what they would have gotten. So it's a little bit better on the second round of multifamily for the school district. After that, there's a kicker again as well, where we established a funding level in the city's TIF fund of, I think, 1.5 times debt service. I don't recall what it is off the top of my head, but we grow a cash in years really 16 to 30. And then once that starts to grow beyond 1 year's debt service, we then start comping the school district again for revenues they've lost in the previous years. This was presented to the school district as, an option that they liked. Again, Pat said they haven't officially passed this yet, but this was the model that they agreed with in order for the development to move forward. So,
yeah, and then the last thing I just want to ask, there's been, from your all's perspective, I think a critical component of this is the inclusion of the clock tower as, an expense paid for, I guess, by the TIF or in the bonds. That's not been there's been no changes of that, right? Basically the elevator to allow people to go up to the clock tower.
Yeah, this is going back and forth. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's an elevator in there or not, but there is access. I think there is an elevator for...
I believe it is, and basically what has happened, it has been evolving a little bit, but basically what we've told them, and the stance has been that the TIF money from the city is not going to go into the clock tower unless you can go up into the clock tower. That's sort of that's the end of that question. So if the TIF money is going to go into the clock tower, now, I don't know exactly, that's a school district question too. The school district, frankly, I assume is on the same page with you all.
We don't know that. We don't know that, which is why I'm asking. Is I just didn't know if there's been any updates or any causes for concern or red flags that they don't want that as part of the TIF.
No, that has been their stance. We have made it very clear that that's important to everybody involved. And again, we have said that if there is not public access to that clock tower, and that's not going to be included in what you can spend the TIF money on. And so when we come back for the TIF, for the discussion about the TIF, that TIF legislation will have a list of what can financed with the TIF revenues and TIF bonds that are going to be paid with it. So we will include something in there that's not going to be a TIF eligible use, or a TIF eligible component of the project, unless it is made available to the public for.
And I'll just ask if you, just my request to you, could you reach out to, if something changes where it looks like the school district is pushing back on that or does not want that in part of it, if you could just send me an email, I would really appreciate that. So.
Yeah, and so so like I said, I think that we can do this one of two ways. We can come back in 2 weeks if you want to give any updates. I mean, we may come, frankly, this got bumped back a little bit. We were hoping to get this, not us, but the developer, I guess, was pushing to try to get this done and passed by next meeting. So we were really focused on providing flexibility if you wanted to with respect to the CRA. But because we do have some more time, I think that, and I can talk to Keith, but it may be work, it might work best for everybody if I came back with the TIF legislation for a first reading in 2 weeks, and then we pass the TIF and the CRA, finally at the same time on the meeting on the 11th, if that works for everybody. And that way we'll have the school board's approval. We'll have had further discussions if we need to on the TIF, and everything at that point will hopefully be finalized and locked in.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, I'm not trying to micromanage it. It's just that's a very important component, and I'd rather address it before we have to have 3 readings at a meeting on it, basically. So that's why I was just trying to get an update on it.
Yeah, and we've tried to impress that upon them at every chance we have. We have pretty regular meetings with them, and that is a question because it has changed a little bit, and we've told them that the council and school board and everybody said you can't use this money for that unless you can use it, and it's open to the public. So, yes, I will certainly make sure that it's communicated to this group if that changes. So.
Yeah, and also, I guess in the second part, just if the school district were to say, look, those specific TIF dollars should be going, they shouldn't be used in that purpose. That's another thing that I would just like to know about is that.
Say that one more time, sorry.
Basically, if the school district doesn't want the TIF dollars used for the clock tower at all, that would be something that I think that we all want to know about.
Oh, yeah, no, again, they too are, that's okay with them as long as it is open to the public.
Okay,
they're on the same page.
That's the big concern. Yeah, great.
Yeah. And from a legal perspective, frankly, it's not a public infrastructure improvement if you can't use it. Just looking at it doesn't make it even though we all want it, the public wants it, it doesn't make it a
Mr. Tracy.
eligible.
Thank you.
Cost.
Mr. Tracy.
I believe we put the Norwood sign across Montgomery Road or across 562 utilizing TIF from Linden Point. However, I can't go up and stand on that sign. I can't throw a ball against the sign. I can't use the sign publicly. All I can do is look at it. However, that TIF money from Linden Point paid for that sign. Am I correct? I don't know if you've gone back to look at Linden Point stuff.
I wasn't involved in that original financing, but the fact that it's part of a bridge, I think, frankly, makes it a little bit different. The fact that
I think as a council, we need to look at that and say, even if they can't get access up to the top of the clock tower, that's a historic landmark for this community. We're already losing our water towers.
I don't think the conversation has been that if we don't give them the money, they're not going to protect the clock tower. I think that's part of this. It's just a question of whether, the TIF money can be used to do that if it's not open to the public.
Well, again, just because I can walk across a bridge doesn't mean I can use the sign.
So, Mr. Tracy, the thing is they really don't need that much money for the clock tower if it's not going to be open to the public. Part of the expenses of opening it to the public are just making it safe from a fire perspective and potentially having an elevator in it. And so when I was asking my questions, the concerns, again, we're just making sure that the school district is on board. It sounds like they are on board from what I've heard from Mr. Wood.
They are. And again, I think that there is not a question of whether they're going to preserve the clock tower.
My statement was made that we're not going to utilize that TIF. There's going to have to be repairs to that clock tower. At some point, there's going to have to be repairs. So who's going to shell out the money for those repairs?
That clock tower is an iconic part of that site. For Factory 52, it's not Factory 52 without the clock tower. So they've got a plan for it. If for some reason they said we have to have TIF dollars, there's not going to be public access, I'm sure they would be pushing back.
Sorry.
Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. President. To speak on Linden Point, that was part of a larger redevelopment deal that also involved that they were required to buy what is now the medical office building across the street from the fire station and redo that. There was the bridge. There was a host of other issues involved in that project. I think for this one, I think the council, it depends on what council and the school board want. If they want a guarantee, if they want a guarantee from the developer that there will be public access into that clock tower, then I think we're fine to say, we're not doing anything unless we get that as a written guarantee as a part of the project. As far as whether the dollars go for that or they don't go for that for public use, I think the hard part on this one is they have much, much more public use things that they could spend on for a public purpose. It's way beyond what the amount of the TIF is anyway. So they can move the money. Oh, we can say we're spending on the clock tower, but actually we're just taking over here. Or, okay, don't use the TIF money for the clock tower, but we still have to spend what would count as public use money over here. But the question is what it is that council and the school board want. If they want to guarantee access, that you're in a position to say, we're not going to approve the TIF if we don't get public access into the clock tower. I mean, that's something that we have. I think what I'm confused about at this point is if that's what Mr. Geraci is saying, that we need that or that really doesn't matter as long as the project gets done and the tower remains, whether or not people can go in. But that's something that can be made, whatever conditions. You guys are offering them money, tax abatements. There's a PUD over it. If you want to put conditions on what happens on the project, you're able to do that. They may say, well, then we're not going to do the project, but that's within the power of council to say, I'm not going to approve this if we don't get this.
Well, there are different statutes. The Linden Point was done under a different section of the High Revised Code that has a different standard. It's what's included in a development agreement between the two parties, whereas the TIF has a different definition of what constitutes public infrastructure improvements, and I just don't personally think that it's within the scope of that to have it done. But I think there are plenty of other ways. I mean, I think your point is not really what the funds come from, what they're used for, but just the clock tower is protected, correct?
My question was whether or not there's public access to the top of that clock tower, whether they can make it safe for public to access it. It's still part of the infrastructure of this city. So whether it's something that people go up and take pictures of, or whether it's something somebody can go up, we shouldn't block a TIF just because somebody can't go to the top of the clock tower.
Yeah, I just want to just comment on this. Okay, so for anybody at home that's listening, nobody is talking about demolishing the clock tower at all. Like the developers, no, there are people that are confused. I've gotten a message about this. No, I just want to clarify for people at home, that's not for you. The second part of that is, as Mr. Moore said, they have, I don't know how many millions of dollars that this TIF would be. They have a ton of public infrastructure that they're going to do, and not all of it they're going to use TIF dollars for. So if they can't use money for the clock tower for some reason, they're just going to use it something else. They still have to spend all that money. So, I mean, nobody's expressed any concern whatsoever that they don't have enough money to preserve the clock tower. I mean, nobody said that. I don't know why we're worrying about that part of it.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzel. Mr. Tracy?
Well, Mr. Bonzel, you brought up the fact of demolition. I never said at demolition. I never even said get rid of it.
I'm only bringing it up because, like, literally I had somebody message me about it, and I'm trying to make sure everybody knows.
Can I talk, please? Thank you. I had said that from what I'm understanding is that we are not going to use TIF money on that or include it in the TIF if there's not public access to it. Public access to me is I can walk up to that clock tower, take a picture with the clock tower, and walk away. Just like I can do with the sign on Montgomery Road. You know, I never said anything about demolishing it. I never said anything about getting rid of it. I said there's probably going to need repairs done to it at some point. It's mortar and brick. You know, are we expecting them to do those repairs on that later down the road? Or can they utilize the TIFs for that? My point was, because this is the first time I'm hearing that council has agreed to only use that as a TIF fund if there's public access to it. I disagree with that. It should be included as much as possible with the TIF, whether there's access to the top of that or not. Plain and simple. It is a public infrastructure of this city. and this is the first time I've heard anything about council agreed to this. If it's the first time I'm hearing about it, I didn't agree to it.
Well, I'll clarify. It's been communicated to me that the city administration collectively were hoping that this would be open to the public. And to the extent we can influence that decision with the incentives that we're providing, that was the goal that we should collectively try to achieve. If that's not the case, that's perfectly fine.
That's one goal we should look at and say, you know what, whether or not they can get access up to the top of that, it needs to be part of the Norwood infrastructure. It's a historical landmark. It doesn't, I'm not saying that it's going to be demolished. I'm saying we need to help them keep that in good working order, even if it's just a picture point.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Mr. DiNardo.
Maybe a way to address that, Matt, is to, or Mr. Tracy, is to find out who is not wanting the guarantee put in place. I think what Mr. Moore explained to us is that we have a bit of leverage here. We might as well use that to get something we want. And I guess the assumption was made that most people in Norwood would want access to that, so why not use the leverage that we have? What I'm hearing you say is, no, we don't want to use the leverage for that. That's not, potentially not really important to residents. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of people that think that.
Okay.
Mr. Tracy.
Once again, let's twist words again. I did not say that. Absolutely, I would love to go up to the clock tower. Okay? Absolutely. I'm not saying that. Every resident would love to go up to the clock tower and take a picture from up top there. Okay? I'm saying if it's not possible for them to gain access to that safely and allow safe, viewing up top, and all of a sudden now we're not going to give them any money because they can't get residents safely to the top, we shouldn't withhold TIF money from them because of that. Again, if I have to repeat it a third time, I'll repeat it a third time. Yes, absolutely, I want them to get, but I'm not going to force them to do something that is unsafe.
Anyone else? Mr. Kelch.
Thank you, Mr. President. I mean, what Mr. Tracy is trying to say, I believe, is, oh God, or whatever. I'm trying to translate this because I want to get out of here at some point tonight before midnight. I think what he's trying to say, please correct me if I'm wrong.
You will.
Yeah, he would love access to it. He wants money for it no matter what. Access or no access. End of discussion, maybe.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Anyone else? Thank you, gentlemen.
Of course. Thank you.
The motion on the floor is by Mr. Thompson, second by Mr. Gabbard to have the first reading. Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzo?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. DeRacy?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yeah.
Mr. Thompson? Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. May we have the first reading, Mrs. Williams?
An ordinance authorizing the City of Norwood to enter into community reinvestment area agreements with Playing Card Partners, LLC, authorizing the city to enter into a related school compensation with the Norwood City School District and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Moving on to item M, administrative reports. Mayor Schneider.
Thank you, President Miracle. We're making progress on street repairs. Indian Mound, Sheridan, Wakefield Place, curbing going in. They're really making good progress, I'm pleased to say. So we're going to have some of that stuff done early in the season this year. They are working, the Safety Service Director and staff are working on the other streets, making sure everything's squared away so we can get some other streets completed. That'll probably be that work will be let later in the year. The street sweeper's out running. Typically, remember, the street sweeper typically runs the day after your trash day. So if you're parking in front of your house the day after your trash day and it's during the day, you're probably not going to get your street in front of your house swept. So keep that in mind. C-Click Fix is active. I see people using, I saw somebody using it like an hour ago here at the community center, but C-Click Fix is active. Please continue to get into that app and put them in because that really is helpful for Public Works. The Norwood Bridge sign that we were all discussing and the letters, NORWOD, There was some work that was done on that and replaced. It was working one day, and then I went past another day, and there was an O and an R not working, so they know that. And we will get them back operational pretty quick. But the actual film that was replaced, the outer part that had I don't know, what does plastic do? Sort of, it just gets coated or not very visible, see-through it? Did you have a name for it?
No, sir.
There's a proper name for it. I can't think of it right now, but that's working. We did receive a grant for a charging station that will be put in place at Sherman and Station Park, in the Sherman and Station parking lot right there by the high school. Hopefully, we've got some high school teachers that are into that and other people that are into charging their cars. Montgomery Road, you might have noticed that Clint was out there and did a lot of spot marking for repairs. So some of that rippled, some of the humped areas will be taken care of here soon. And then we are trying to get in place to freshen up and restripe all the white pavement markings that need to be painted, but there is a shortage on paint. I was told to lower my expectations. I would have liked for them to be doing it right now because it makes such a difference, but there's a problem with that. 562 lights, hopefully some of you have noticed that some of the lights are activated. We're finding a lot of breaks in service lines from over the years where there were digs and different things going on. I do want to talk again about Norwood Together and pulling together the groups that did the parks and the Montgomery Road cleanup, the business corridor cleanup, and then of course Public Works worked in conjunction with Cincinnati Public Works and did the big lateral cleanup. And even as I go out there, it seems like the trash just continues to rain down on that thing. So we've got to do some routine maintenance on that to keep it looking good. Recently, I went on Saturday, we had a recreation task force meeting on Saturday morning. And then Councilman Bonzel and Councilman Gabbard and our new recreation director, Phil Kraby, we attended the Norwood Knothole opening day, which was great to see. It's a lot of fun to see them out there. And it was at Shea Stadium. They did the walk. We proclaimed it, Norwood Knothole Day. Had a lot of fun with that. And then also MJ Gabbard, one of the Gabbards, who's went through that whole knothole system, started out in T-ball and worked all the way up through and is now a senior in high school, received $1,000, we think it's $1,000 yearly scholarship from the Norwood Knothole Association and the Norwood Firefighters Association. They have a fundraising arm of the Norwood Firefighters that do that too. So it was great to see a Norwood kid receive a scholarship from there. The new recreation director, Phil Kraby, started, I think all of you should have received an email on that, and he's got his feet on the ground. I really think he does because of the task force. The task force has been meeting for the past 2 months or so and sort of putting ideas together. So they are going to work as a partner and as a guide to this new Norwood recreation director, and I think he'll do great. So that's going to be interesting with their help. It's going to take a lot of help from all of us. I do want to clarify that the streets, when we talk about Factory 52, the streets that are within Factory 52 will not be dedicated streets. So the city of Norwood will not be maintaining those. We will not be running plows through there. We will not be salting that area back in there. They will stay part of the development. But the water distribution line, there will be a water main that runs down and runs back through, connects to our water distribution line. So that will be the city's responsibility to continue to maintain that. So we are working with engineering. Clint's involved in making sure that that water line is put in properly, and we'll have an engineering tech watching that and making sure that's done. So we're on it. But I want to make sure it's clear that we won't be running our plows through there and stuff. Parks are getting busier, and everybody needs to realize, and if people call you, please make sure they know, you can reserve the parks. You need reservations if you're going to use one of those shelter houses for an event of some sort, and that's calling the recreation number, which is 531 9798. It's been that for the last 20 years. It's not changing, but that's how to get into reservations. And then vaccinations are going on. I just went past the health department. They're doing walk-in vaccinations now, so hopefully all the council members have received their vaccination, everybody? Okay, but others can walk in. It's always better to call and schedule an appointment, but it's an easy call, 458-4515, and you can walk in and get your vaccination. That's an important aspect. And then Councilman Gabbard caught me this morning. I was going into the Pike Street Cafe for breakfast, but the Pike Street Cafe has a good breakfast menu going, and actually they're open until after lunch. It's delicious food. Larry in there is just a super nice guy. They greet you as you walk in. It's clean. It's really nice. They've got all the barriers up. That restaurant's going. I know that the Indian Mound Cafe is open and needs support. Quatman Cafe is open. Come on into the restaurants. Gordo's, I was in Gordo's for lunch the other day. Their food is just spectacular, as it has been since he opened that place up. So we've got a lot of little local restaurants that are operating right now that would love to see you. So please do make a point to hit your local Norwood restaurant. All the Rookwood stuff's been open, but these are our local ones that we all know and love. So please do spend a few minutes hitting those. That's all I got.
Thank you, Mayor Schneider. Any questions or comments for Mayor Schneider? Mr. Kelch.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know we got to talk briefly before the meeting, but just for everybody else at home, can you give us a little update on Elm Avenue, storm sewer stuff, and kind of where we're at with that in relation to what JMA has?
Yeah, we got some engineering stuff back, and actually with the budget being passed now, we have some funding that's put in place to do that. We are working on looking at any type of stormwater easements, and that's something that's still on the front burner. Councilman Kelch, it's still on the front burner. It was something, I think I mentioned it at the last council meeting. I think I mentioned it, that was a question with the Financial Recovery Commission, and they questioned whether that was really a legitimate fund or legitimate amount of money that we needed to spend on that. And I told them absolutely, it is a problem in our neighborhood that needs to be fixed, and we'll continue to make progress on that, and hopefully we can move forward as quickly as possible.
Mr. Tracy.
Through the chair to the mayor. Do we have any updates from, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks ago regarding the signs, the Welcome to Norwood signs?
Yeah, you just approved some funding for that. You're talking about monument signs, less of the signs that are up on a post, and more of the low ground monument signs?
Anything other than the metal signs?
Yes, you just put some funding in place, so yeah. We can upgrade some of those signs to make it look much nicer, yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Anyone? Mr. Brady.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. First of all, sorry to interrupt your administrative report there. But you said besides the discoloring of the plexiglass or whatever's in them signs, can you go into more detail? You said that there was more, like, it was a little more than just changing the bulbs out in those. Do you know exactly what balusters, or do you know exactly what happened? What was done?
Excuse me. When Councilman Gabbard brought it up first, we did an inspection of it. We took the backs off and found out, oh, the lights are on. Everything's active. It was just the actual lettering is plastic, and I guess the UV on it, if it was glass, you'd see right through it. But it's a coated plastic. It's like a white plastic, and that plastic had just basically frosted up, so you couldn't see through it. So it would be easy if it wasn't over the highway and if it didn't have the fencing behind it. So those pieces are pretty big. So we had to actually take the fencing off, and then Hold House Signs had to come in and take the back of the signs off to get the whole piece out and put a new piece in. The problem is now that we have that done, we have 2 ballast or 2 lights that aren't working properly, so maybe it's a loose connection or something. So we should have it up and running again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
The
Brady.
hard part's done.
Anyone else? Thank you, Mayor Schneider.
Thank you.
Moving on to unfinished business. I know, Mr. Tracy, that you had asked for the nuisance appeals board to be placed on there. Or is it Mr. Kelch?
If I could, I would like to table this discussion, probably till next meeting or the one after that. We just had a meeting earlier about the task force where it's getting started. I just feel like it's appropriate to push this a little bit till we get that kind of going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Any unfinished business? Mr. Bunzel?
I guess I just had a question about that. I mean, so do we have a plan for how we want to approve members, I mean, on it? I guess, are you saying that, are we going to have the housing committee bring recommendations to it, to the full council, or are we going to just have discussions at the next meeting?
That's what I would like.
I had initially wanted it to go through the housing committee to bring recommendations. However, I'd much rather have the discussion with a full council, rather than the four of us coming up and saying, these three people we would like to bring in, and then having everybody else say yay or nay.
Mr. Bunzel?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I understand that. I mean, I guess it shouldn't take, an extreme amount of time, so I think we could do it at a council meeting. I mean, just having a recommendation from a committee is somewhat helpful, just because it means that we've had time to discuss it and talk about it. But, I mean, I'm good either way. I've got some ideas about it, so, like I said, if you want to, are you not planning on calling a housing meeting then for this topic? Is that what you're saying?
I wasn't planning on it, because under the ordinance, it states that council, it doesn't state that it would go through the housing committee first. I mean, I guess we can put it into the housing committee. We could do committee of the whole too, but we would have to vote it into that.
Sorry.
That's fine, Mr. Gabbard.
Point of
I mean, I think, like, I don't want to have a special committee the whole meeting just for this topic. I mean, I think we can probably just discuss it at the next council meeting if that's, if the housing committee's not gonna come. But we have the resumes, so they're all sent to us by the clerk of council, so I would just say, reach out to people if you want to, or what have you, but maybe we potentially invite the people to come to the next council meeting. I don't know what the right thing is, but either way, I just would like to get us to approve this, sooner rather than later, just so they can know that they're going to be, who it's going to be, essentially.
Mr. Tracy?
And I agree with that. We had pushed it from the last meeting to this meeting, knowing that we were going to meet and greet the task force last week, and unfortunately, that didn't happen. So, the discussion tonight was supposed to be over these resumes and decide who we're going to pick. I don't have a problem pushing it to the next meeting because we're still within April.
Yeah, that's the 27th.
So, the reason I pushed it to this meeting was to give everybody ample time, I think about 3 weeks, to go over the resumes. So that way, everybody would have ample time to go over the resumes. However, because of our snafu last week, I'm going to agree that we push it off until at least the next meeting. Because even if I have a housing meeting next week to go over them, we're still going to be waiting until the next meeting, so.
Gotcha. And I just want to note that Emily Dilly is here tonight. She did apply to be one of the members of the task force, so just wanted to note that she was here. I think she probably saw on the agenda.
And I appreciate that, and, unfortunately, and I'm sorry, unforeseen circumstances that happened, and now I will call a housing meeting after next week's meeting to have the members come in so that we can go over what their roles are. What, it's going to be kind of like the zoning committee or zoning board, where they kind of make their rules, regulations, things like that. Figure out who's going to head it up, who's going to do what jobs.
Gotcha. Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen. Anything else under unfinished business? Mr. Tracy?
I'm looking over the Norwood Fire Department activities and stats, and once again, for I guess the 4th month in a row now, I don't see the mutual aid runs on here that I requested 3 times. So I don't know what else I need to do other than try to request the exact same thing that I requested the last time.
Mayor Schneider?
Well, I've given you the report each time. I've told you this is the only time that I came and didn't question the fire department on that. But I can get that and give it to you. But I have verbally told you what our runs have been, and you pretty much just shook your head. And so I thought, well, okay, that's not critically important to you. So You didn't ask before, and I volunteered that information. This time, I'm not volunteering the information, and you're asking.
But I asked the chief to specifically put it on this piece of paper.
Yeah, I did not
So,
ask
again-
I did not ask the chief to do that.
Well, I asked in a letter that it be put on there, so I guess, okay,
I think the mayor's
All right.
implying that the chief reports to the city administration.
that's fine.
Thank you,
Once
Mr.
again,
Tracy.
administration not respecting.
Any other unfinished business? We'll move on to new business. Wow, a lot of hands up. Mr. Bonzo.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I'd like to refer to the Housing Committee issue of residential parking, either residential parking or residential permit parking, just for very specific areas in the city. I mean, I don't want to name those areas now because I think it's just something for the committee to kind of talk about and figure out, but you know, there are specific areas in the city where due to either events or attractions or what have you, residents that live there have trouble finding parking because there's people that don't live in that specific area that are driving to it. So, I mean, I'll just give one example. It could be the houses across from the high school specifically. So, but we do want to look at that and just see, you know, essentially what can be done. So I want to refer those residential parking / residential parking permits to the Housing Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Any other new business? Mr. Tracy.
I'd like to request that we return to council chambers for, starting in the May meetings.
Do we got to
Thank
make
you,
that
Mr.
motion
Tracy.
here, or is that?
Any other
like-
comments?
I think-
Mr. Kelch?
Are we commenting? Is that what you said?
Yes, but did you?
I think that would be amazing.
Okay. Mr. Bonzo?
Yeah, I personally don't know why, I don't understand what the rush would be to move to council chambers. I mean, essentially, for our guests, there's more room here. For us, there's more room here. I mean, to me, it makes sense to stay here for the moment, but.
Mr. Tracy?
I'd like to make a motion to return to council chambers for council meetings.
Motion by Mr. Geraci. Mr. Kelch?
Second?
Second. Discussion? Mr. Thompson?
Say we wait on it until we get direction from the state that certain size groups can meet in small rooms. That's the whole reason we're here.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Geraci?
The state has made recommendations and has changed those recommendations as well to allow larger groups.
Mr. Kelch?
I would go along with what Mr. Tracy just said, that they have made recommendations where you go inside with people if you're in your group of 10, and you got another group of 10, and another group of 10. I mean, I think our time here has kind of ran its course. I'm glad that was brought up tonight, because I would love to get back into council chambers where we belong. I think we're far enough through this thing that we can make that happen safely and confident. We've had this place packed wall to wall before, so let's get back to where we should be doing our legislation from.
Any other comments? Mr. Bonzo?
Yeah, I think Mr. Kelch just actually made the point to vote against this. We've had this place packed wall to wall before, and in council chambers, there's even less room for people in there that are watching the meeting. So I'm just going to be voting no on it. I mean, you know, I'll show up at the meeting wherever it is, you know, but I think I'm fine being here.
Anyone else? Mr. Thompson?
You mentioned you have your one group of 10, one group of 10 or whatever you can have together, and that's fine. That's all of us. We're getting vaccinated, but we also have to think of the safety of our residents, and so I think it's premature.
Mr. Tracy?
I'm tired of pushing the goalpost back.
What?
I'm tired of pushing the goalpost back.
Did we set a time limit for when we?
Your motion was to go back. Did you say a date?
No,
I thought I heard you say May. But
yes, the motion's still there. I just think certain members of this council seem to be pushing those goalposts back like the rest of the politicians around the country. So, you know, whether or not we had a timeline or a deadline, we're still kind of looking at it going, oh, we're still in March of 2020. No, we're not. We've made significant strides. it's time to go home.
Anyone else have any comments?
Say we vote.
Motion on the floor was by Mr. Geraci, seconded by Mr. Kelch to return to council chambers. Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzo?
No.
Mr. Gabbard?
No.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Braden?
No.
No. All members present voting, we have 4 noes and 3 ayes. Motion fails. Anything else in new business, gentlemen? Mr. Gabbard?
If I could request maybe the mayor, it's something we've never gotten before. I'm just curious if maybe we could get a monthly report from the building department when new business comes in, because they got to come and get permits, that we would just kind of know, hey, this is a new business, this is where it's located, this is what it is. Maybe just a monthly report on that, because a lot of times we're getting phone calls or messages, or people catch us out somewhere and they're like, hey, I heard such and such is going in there. I have no idea. And they look at us like, why don't you know? I have to explain, just because we're council people don't mean we know everything about everything that's going on in the city. But I just thought it might be a neat thing for council to be able to get that, so we can disseminate that information when asked, and just kind of be aware of what's coming in, and hopefully encourage, that new business as they come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gabbard. Anyone else? Mr. Geraci, I'd like to place into your committee a law and ordinance to review the council rules. You could discuss the alternate delivery of our packets, perhaps electronic. Thank you, sir. Mr. Geraci.
I'd like to request that you and yourself and Ms. Williams be present at that meeting as well.
We'll be there. Anyone else? That concludes new business. We'll move on to P, Communications. P1, Ohio Division of Liquor Control regarding A&R Rookwood LLC. Mrs. Williams.
We've got a communication from the Ohio Division of Liquor Control regarding A&R Rookwood doing business as Agave and Rye. It's the notice, important notice. Please complete and return this form to the Division of Liquor Control, whether or not there is a request for a hearing. And we need to mark whether we are requesting a hearing or not.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Thompson.
Move we file a letter and reply that we are not requesting a hearing.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to receive and file and complete the form that we're not requesting a hearing. May I have a second? Mr. Kelch.
Second.
Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzo?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes. Moving on to item P2, Ohio Division of Liquor Control regarding GB License LLC.
This is the same kind of notice from the Ohio Division of Liquor Control, this time about GB License LLC, requesting the council advise whether we are requesting a hearing on the issuing of the permit.
Yes. That's CVS Pharmacy. Mayor Schneider just told me that was for CVS Pharmacy. Mr. Thompson.
We receive and file and reply that we do not request a hearing.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to receive and file and complete the form that we're not requesting.
Second.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzo?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, motion passes. Item 3, Mayor Victor Schneider regarding Mayor's Court fines. Mrs. Williams.
Letter dated April 2nd, 2021, to Mr. Ken Miracle and members of Norwood City Council regarding mayor court fines. Dear President and members of council, enclosed, please find the report for Norwood Mayor's Court for the month of March 2021. Should you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. Sincerely, Victor Schneider, Mayor, City of Norwood.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Tracy.
Make a motion to file or receive and file.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Motion by Mr. Tracy to receive and file. Mr. DiNardo.
Can I second that?
Second by Mr. DiNardo. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Butzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yep.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Item P4, Norwood Planning Commission regarding 2692 Madison Avenue, request for map amendment zone change.
Communication dated April 9th of 2021 to Norwood City Council from John P. Murphy, Chairman of the Norwood Planning Commission. Regarding 2692 Madison Avenue, request for map amendment/zone change. On April 7th of 2021, the Norwood Planning Commission held a public hearing of a map amendment for 2692 Madison Road, Norwood, Ohio, 45208, to change the zoning map from a heavy manufacturing zone, District M2, to general business zoning, District GBD. Planning Commission listened to all testimony along with the rationale presented by staff and then voted to recommend to Norwood City Council that the proposed zoning map change be approved. Per section 1117.10 of the Norwood Zoning Code, upon receipt of the recommendations of the Planning Commission, the Norwood City Council shall schedule a public hearing and final action.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Bonzo.
Thank you, Mr. President. So we're going to have, I guess we'll have two of these. The first meeting that we could schedule it for would be the May 25th meeting. We need 30 days out.
Okay.
I think we need 30 days out, right? This is yeah, I mean, I know that we do for the PUD. I'm guessing that we do for this as well. So I think it'd be right. But the May 25th would be that first meeting. I personally likely won't be at that meeting, but I mean, I think that's a great meeting to have the public hearing at since.
Can you do both of them?
Yeah, I was gonna say, that's a good point, yeah. So I would make a motion that we have the 2692 Madison Avenue public hearing and the 2699 Edmondson Road public hearing and receive and file both letters.
So we have a motion by Mr. Bonzo to receive and file the 2692 Madison request and the 2699 Edmondson Road request, and to schedule a public hearing for both on May the 25th, 2021.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Mr. Tracy.
Second.
Second by Mr. Tracy. Any further discussion? Mr. Tracy.
Kind of confused why this wasn't done back when Brookwood was built, but I guess we can do it now. That's fine. Been years that it's been sitting there, so.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Anyone else? Mr. Bonzo.
Yeah, I mean, from my understanding, I actually have not watched that planning commission meeting. The mayor can comment, but there is a very specific reason why this needs changed now.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, this pertains to the old Don Pablo's building, which was the power plant for the old LeBlanc manufacturing site. And the reason it was heavy manufacturing zoned, I'm not sure why it wasn't changed years ago, but we have a restaurant that's very interested in the site and moving forward with plans. That's going to be exciting, this restaurant, but getting this changed is the first step in getting that corrected. So, and when we had the public hearing, nobody showed up in opposition of it for that site, you know.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Anyone else? Please call the roll.
So to confirm, though, the motion is to receive and file both letters and to schedule both public hearings, correct?
Yes, on May 25th.
Okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Please call the roll.
Okay, Mr. Bonzo?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
about Mr. Brady?
Mr. Braden.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Moving on to item R, adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Kelch,
Motion adjourned?
second by Mr. Braden. Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunzel.
That's what the letter said we were doing.
Yeah, I don't think people's ready.
Oh, that's cool.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
No.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson. Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting, we have 6 ayes, 1 no. We are adjourned.